Hello, hello, hello. I am Jane Allen, and I am so thrilled to see all of you and welcome you to the Nashville Entrepreneur Center. As some of you know, and some of you may not know, but now you do, we have really made an effort to bring in our city's business leaders, successful entrepreneurs to talk about their journey, to inspire, to let us all learn from, and those who actually are out there leading our community. And so needless to say, Mr. Hicks is one of those people we just could not wait to bring in. One, he is an entrepreneur. Two, he is a very successful businessman. And three, he's actually an advisor at the EC. So we hope we're going to be seeing a lot more of him. But what today he also, now correct me, you had the vision, right?
I was one of the people that had a vision.
Yeah.
I didn't start it, but I kind of carried the ball.
Yeah, and I think as any entrepreneur knows, sometimes we have visions that are just crazy, and sometimes we have visions that actually others believe in too, and they work together and collaborate, and you move it forward. And so needless to say, we're here today because you and your team have been able to do that. And so we have the Museum of African American Music from concept to completion. It's over 56,000 square feet. And it's actually awesome. If you haven't been there, you've got to go. It's right downtown Nashville. It's just another reason people should flock to this city. And at the same time, we are going to hear what inspired you to actually take this journey. So rather than me talk, you don't want to hear me, you want to hear him. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Hicks, and thank you all for being here.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I thought that what I would do is really just kind of tell you the story of the museum and how we got it done, and maybe some of the bumps that we had along the way, and then I'll stop and I'll let y'all ask me questions to talk about what you want to talk about. I find that to be generally a lot more interesting than whatever it is I plan to say. So, yes.
One other thing, we do have a virtual audience.
Okay. Sure.
They may send questions in the chat.
That'd be awesome.
Shelby will type in questions from our virtual.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. That'd be perfect. So just kind of by way of background, my background is I'm a kid who grew up in D.C. and went to college in Atlanta at Morehouse College and then graduate school at the University of North Carolina where I got my MBA. When I finished my MBA, one of the things that I discovered about myself is I was always very entrepreneurial, very sort of lots of big ideas. I was not a particularly good finance person or accounting person, but I learned it. And I took jobs right out of graduate school in finance and accounting so that I would learn to make my weakness a strength. So I went into investment banking, private equity, management consulting, all focused on finance. But it wouldn't last, and so eventually I needed to go be an entrepreneur. I worked for a private equity firm in Chicago that focused on doing leveraged buyouts of companies that were or could be suppliers, diverse suppliers to the Fortune 500. Did that for 6 or 7 years, and then took some time off to buy a company of my own. Bought a company here in Nashville called Gray Line of Tennessee, so the bus company that you see running around town. Bought that business in 2009. A month after I bought that company, I joined the board of what was then called the Museum of African American Music, Art, and Culture. It took about a year and a half, and I became chair of that board, working very closely with the woman, Paula Roberts, who was the executive director at the time. In 2012, I sold the Gray Line business, and there was a desire to push one last hard time to get the museum over the goal of getting it done. And so I agreed initially to become CEO for a period of 2 years to try to get the museum completed. That was 8.5 years ago. And we did finally get it done, but it obviously was a lot more difficult than I thought it would be at the time. So the museum, as I mentioned, started in 1998 as an idea. By 2001, it had become a concept that the Chamber of Commerce had bought into and wanted to support. it was really seen as an economic development project. It was not a social justice project. It was not necessarily just a community inclusion project. It was an economic development project because the Convention and Visitors Corporation, which at the time was a part of the Chamber of Commerce, recognized that there were lots of conventions and meetings and tourists who were not coming to visit Nashville because it was not seen as a diverse and welcoming community for diverse audiences. And so the museum would have a way of dealing with that and sort of saying to those communities that they were in fact welcome. And so that's what really was the initial driver for moving the museum forward. Originally the museum was going to be located in Metro Center where I understand there was a place called the Sankofa Museum. And then it was going to be located at Rosa Parks in Jefferson on the site of where today the State of Tennessee Museum sits. And then I was just explaining earlier, working with Mayor Carl Dean, we agreed to move the museum site to the location at 5th and Broadway. The reason why I thought it would only take 2 years is because originally the plan was not to tear the old convention center down, but just to renovate it. And we would just kind of move in, build out our interior space and keep it moving. Didn't work that way. And so it became a much more complicated process. Crazy idea. I think this museum was a crazy idea. Getting people behind it was 3 to 5 to 10 times harder than I ever imagined that it would be. It really, we were very fortunate to have the government interested and supportive of it early on. Not only the mayor's office, but in particular the minority caucus of the city council saw this as something that would work. And that was just enough leverage to be able to work with the corporate and the philanthropic communities to be supportive of the effort, little by little by little. There are things that we did along the way to make it work. We started doing educational programming very early, which, I will tell you, we had a board meeting to talk about doing that, and it was not a unanimous vote that said we should move into doing educational programming, but we got it approved by the board to start spending energy on that. And the reason for that was the board really thought substantially that my focus as the leader of the organization should be solely on raising money for building the building. That made sense, except for that I had donors telling me that we had not made a case for the mission of the museum. We were not living the mission, and so they would not support building brick and mortar when they couldn't understand whether the mission actually would be applicable to this market or not. So doing the educational programming was a way that I could ask for smaller chunks of money, and I could do things in and around the community that caused young people and adults alike to become bought in to what we were doing at the museum. It began to demonstrate the mission all over the region, even before we had a building. And so we called it Museum Without Walls because we took the museum out to the community, and it worked. It also worked financially. It became a profit center, if you will, for us. And I think that grantors understood that we were going to do a program for a particular cost, and some of the costs would go to defray overhead expenses. And so this was a way of defraying operating expenses or overhead expenses, was operating programs. We also decided somewhere early on that we needed to throw a party. And it was not just a party because we wanted to have a party. It was a party, we called it our Celebration of Legends event. And hopefully many of you have been or seen or heard of it. But we call it our Celebration of Legends event because what we realized we needed to do was we needed to demonstrate to the community that this type of talent, would come to Nashville. So African American, especially African American talent that were worldwide names, would come to Nashville and be honored. Number two, and probably more importantly, we needed the community to see and understand that these artists and the music that they sung and performed was actually a part of their own personal soundtracks. The soundtrack of their lives, the songs that they got married to, the songs that they went to prom to, the songs that they listened to on vacation, the songs that they listen to, jam to when they go to parties or clubs or whatever they do for fun, that this is actually the music of their lives. And so while it, to a certain extent, an African American museum in Country Music City might seem as though it's out of place, It really isn't. Music City can mean so much more than country music, as evidenced by the people who listen to and celebrate and enjoy the music. And so this event was a way for people to feel that and experience the joy that comes from participating in that kind of event. And it not only that, but it also was a fundraiser for the museum. So it was a way, again, to offset overhead expenses while we were working to build the capital campaign and get the money raised to support the museum. Bumps along the way, plenty of them. We had things occur like, a squabble with the city council about where the front door of the museum was going to be. So I got a real education in politics and how that works and how it doesn't work, and how, sometimes you kind of have to, play both sides against the middle just a little bit to keep your agenda on track. And so, we were able to kind of work our way through that process. We've got to satisfy legislators at both the city level as well as the state level. We've got to make sure that we're staying in touch with communities in North Nashville and in Belmead. We've got to make sure that we satisfy the music community as well as the corporate community in terms of making sure that everybody's vision, voice are a part of this mission that we now call the museum. So ultimately, what we created was a 56,000 square foot museum. It cost about $63 million. It's located at 5th and Broadway. It's a very unique museum. I like to say it tells a story never before told until now. And so it is not a museum that celebrates a label, a genre, or an artist. It is a museum that really tells the story of American history and the music that came out of periods from slavery to the emergence of kind of the Jim Crow era, into the Great Migration, into the Harlem Renaissance, through the World War I and II periods of time, and then into urban renewal, the war on drugs, and other sort of historical periods in life that all of us have experienced to one degree or another. This is the music of those periods of time, and that's what comes out of the museum. I also like to say that it is not your granddaddy's museum. So, it is not just a place that looks backward by looking at artifacts in cases. It is a place that looks contemporary through the technology that's in the museum. You can find, make, and create the story that you want to create in the museum. And so whether you're 5 years old and sort of a big fan of gaming and playing with technological artifacts, or you're somebody who remembers the dances of the 50s or the 60s or other periods of time, you can experience that and save it through technology and then take it with you when you leave the museum. So it allows for some interactivity in that way. We opened the museum in January of this year on Martin Luther King's birthday. We cut the ribbon, and then we had our dedication ceremony on Juneteenth. This past June, when we thought COVID had gone away, and we were all willing to get together and have a party. So we did that. It's been exciting and exhilarating. People seem to respond very well to the museum and have a good time. But as I tell people all the time, I feel like I'm the dog who caught the bus. So I've spent most of the last 8 years talking about what is going to happen, and now we actually have it. And make no mistake about it, I mean, we are a 501c3 organization, which is typically considered a nonprofit. I don't look at it that way. I think that we are a tax-exempt business that is designed to help people and tell stories. And so that means that I really look at what we're doing as a business. About 50% of our revenues are earned, which means that 50% is contributed. My goal as a business leader and entrepreneur is to reduce my reliance on those contributed dollars. So 50% is way too much. It puts me at risk of sort of the whims of donors in terms of whether they want to help us out today or this week or this year or not. And so I'd really rather get my earned income up to over 80%. And it'll take a minute to get there, but we're thinking through ways to do that so that we can live out the museum's mission without fear or trepidation or without sort of limitations around how and when we can hire people and how and when we can put money into marketing and programs and events and exhibitions and things of that nature. If we can get our earned revenue up substantially, then we can truly operate a business that can last to the benefit of our broader community, both locally and around the country, for many, many years to come. So that's what we're seeking to do. I will stop there because my throat is telling me I've talked long enough. But I'm happy to answer any questions. And if there's any, and I actually like the impolite question, the hard question. Those are my favorite. This is not my museum. It is your museum. It is our city, our community's museum. And so our objective is always to be responsive and to make sure that we're getting it right. So that's why I'm always happy to answer tough questions. So please, yes.
You touched on your fundraising sources a little bit, but what were the main fundraising sources that you took advantage of in order to get started?
Sure. That in and of itself was a bit of a learning and growing experience. This whole thing was really a big faith walk. Of the $63 million, about 50% of it in one way or another came from the city. Not in one fell swoop, but it took some effort to get there. About another 10% came from the state, and that definitely took some lobbying and that sort of thing to be able to get that support. And so that really leaves 40% or still, what is that, 25 or $30 million or so that needed to be raised from the private sector. And so it's a combination of individuals and family foundations, corporations who came together to make up that remaining $25 million.
Nice, thank you.
Sure. Yes, sir.
So you were just speaking to the capital funding. Curious about your operating funding and what that looks like as far as people that engaged, and obviously 60% being government, those that engaged in the capital, are they still engaged in the day-to-day? And what does that kind of look like currently? And what do you see that looking like ahead? Like what kind of budget are you looking ahead toward in the next few years?
Yeah, so yes and no. We've got to interact with those people a little bit differently now that we're open, particularly the governmental resources. Opening the building has opened us up to a different set of opportunities from government funding, meaning that there are grants that we were not eligible for before we opened, that we are now eligible for, and we can pursue them really more at the federal level than at the city or the state level. There are some sort of legislative, tax-related kinds of opportunities that we can pursue to drive some additional revenue that we don't have the ability to get access to today. That's something we hope to get done in the current legislative session, which means it would sort of not be finished until early next year. But that's something that we're working on from those standpoints. We've now got to find different reasons for those capital funders in terms of the non-governmental ones, to engage with us. So some of that begins to look like, instead of corporate dollars coming from philanthropy, it begins to come from marketing, to say, let's do an activation or an event or something at the museum, recognizing that a portion of those dollars goes to defray overhead, but a portion of it goes to connect our brand to the museum. So we've got to look at ways to do that. We now have the opportunity to sell memberships and for people to become members and interact with the museum as often as they like. Ticket revenue, just kind of people walking in the door, really should represent about 40% of our revenue annually, so in a non-COVID year. So we're not sure what that looks like, what that really truly means, of course, since we just opened this year. We're looking at some innovative things to do, like digital memberships, digital-only memberships, which can open up the museum to potential really interested parties, music fans around the world who may only make it to Nashville once in their life. They can still find benefit in a membership if we provide enough digital content that allows them to interact in ways that they find interesting and intriguing. Our retail store has been kind of a great success for us early on. And so we're looking for ways to expand that retail presence. We're going to be featured in one of the stores out at the airport here soon. Our sales team is working on placing products in hotels around the area. And we would, of course, sell product to those hotels and to the airport on a wholesale basis. And then as they pull the product through, we would keep doing that. So that can give us an opportunity to increase our revenue through retail products. Events are a big thing at the museum. We've already had 2 or 3 weddings. I'm hopeful that the COVID numbers keep going in the right direction so we can have plenty of holiday parties this year at the museum. And then, hopefully before long, I'll have the opportunity to kind of turn my attention to really thinking about other businesses and partnerships that we really should be looking at. I think we'll need more real estate for events as well as for storage purposes for artifacts and that kind of thing. So there could be some long-term and some short-term benefit in that. So it really is, as I mentioned earlier, my desire is to go from kind of a 50-50 revenue mix between contributed and earned revenues to where earned revenues are making up a much bigger share of the total mix. Yes?
So my question is around the contemporary aspect of the museum.
Yes.
I have gone to the museum, so congratulations to you and your team.
Thank you.
And I was very shocked to see that you can develop your own playlist. You can also have the dancing area. So I'm assuming that probably took a lot of negotiation because it is so different from a traditional museum. So if you could talk a little bit about kind of the internal politics that may have played themselves out, and also was there any customer research or consumer research that said, yeah, this is what we need to do, and how did you go about acquiring that?
Yeah, so I will tell you, and Dr. John Fleming was our museum director in residence, and if he happens to be watching today, I will apologize to him. We did not do anywhere near the research that we should have done. Audience research is something that is important in terms of really making sure that a museum does what the audience wants it to do. One of the things, but we didn't do any audience research. Maybe we should have. Dr. Fleming would have told me more than once that we needed to. But there were a couple reasons why we didn't. Number one was money was tight. Number two was that the objective of the museum was to attract an audience that wasn't already here. So the proposals that I saw for doing audience research were all around basically standing out on Broadway and asking people what they wanted. Well, that wasn't going to answer the question. So then how do I find out what people around the country who might come to Nashville if we give them the right product, how do I find out what they want? Well, that's a whole different, much more complex, much more expensive, scratch your head, how do you really get the answer to that question? So, I did it kind of anecdotally. I talked to my friends and neighbors and buddies and kind of said, well, if you were a black person, what would you want to see if you came to Nashville? Well, first of all, not as many straw hats and cowboy boots. Okay, well, that's not the locals anyway, but but answering those kinds of questions. The technology piece was something that really came out of discussion amongst the team. It was less, it didn't take a lot of politics or a lot of negotiation to decide to do it. It was really something we thought was important. Again, like early on, there were 2 or 3, phrases that stuck with me very early on about how to get the museum right. One was it needed to be a combination of music and history. And that was really a promise to North Nashville from my perspective. Again, the original name of the museum was the Museum of African American Music, Art, and Culture. And it was really something that the black community was looking forward to celebrating, the Tiger Bells and the Civil Rights Movement and things of that nature, and fine artists that came from North Nashville. And so when we changed the name of the museum to focus it on music, the way to not lose that important constituency was to promise that we would connect them. And so I wanted to try to do that. So how do we do that? And that is by organizing effectively a history museum where naturally the Nashville story comes out a little bit more than if it were genre-based or label-based or artist-based. So that was number one. Number two was a story never before told until now. So we wanted to tell a different story. It needed to be a museum that was telling a story that was different than any other museum in the country, any other music museum in the country. And then finally, it's not your granddaddy's museum. So what does that mean? My kids today are 23 and 19, but 8 years ago, they were in a different stage in their lives, and there were things that they were doing and things that they were listening to that I was kind of saying to myself, I don't necessarily like going to the Smithsonian too often. What's going to make my kids want to go hang out in this place? And so how do we do that? Well, technology is the answer. And it's a music museum, for gosh sake, so it needed to be a noisy place. So, how are we going to use the headphones and we also sort of wrestled with the question of we only have 56,000 square feet, and really kind of about half of that is exhibit space, so about 30,000 square feet. And we're trying to tell this story that's 300 years old, and 300 years of complexity and diversity. So how are we going to do that? Well, technology. Computers allow us to go a whole lot deeper into the story than the artifacts do in the museum. So those were things that were just kind of general themes that kept rising to the top as we were working through that process. And we just kind of kept them top of mind and kept pushing to think outside the box as we were doing it. Now, maybe though, to your point, we spent an awful lot of money with Getty Images and with paying music license fees to be able to use all that music in there. So it took a lot of money to be able to get the rights to do some of the things that we did, but not a lot of politics or negotiation, just more. It took a long time. For those of you who have been to the museum, we have takeover moments in the Rivers of Rhythm gallery that runs down the center of the museum. And one is Prince playing Purple Rain at the Super Bowl. It took a long time to get the NFL to send me that footage. But now that we've done it, now that they've seen it, got it. We got Whitney Houston for you too, right? So it becomes a lot easier once people understand what you're doing. So that was a challenge and something we're going to have to keep up with on a consistent basis. But so that was the bigger piece of it. Yeah. Long answer, short question. Sorry about that.
Hello again. I do have a question about how, what was the first committee you had to organize in order to get started? Like what team did you have to build out first?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I'm not sure I can answer that question because I wasn't here. But in and around 2001, there were a bunch of community charrettes that were done, community meetings and conversations around what a museum would look like and why it would work and what needed to be in it. And so there was a lot of that was designed to get the community bought into whatever concept eventually came out. So that was probably the beginning of it. I would say that over time, one of the committees that we developed was a community advisory council, which was something along the way that we kept the community updated on what was going on with the project. And that was kind of 2012, 13, 14 kind of timing. So well after the project had been talked about for a long time, but still several years away from construction. And that became actually difficult because the community was, they'd show up to these meetings and they'd hear these updates and they kind of, okay, glad to hear the update, but A, when's construction started? And B, what do you want from me? So quit calling me to these meetings if all you're gonna do is tell me what's going on, and it ain't that much. So eventually we actually did away with that group because we felt like we were wasting people's time. One of the things that was really important to us in that vein, though, was we created something called the Barron Society. One of the questions that I would get when I would go talk to philanthropic donors about the museum was, where's the Black community on this project? And they didn't mean, do Black folks think it's a good idea? What they meant was, have Black folks written checks? And so I spent a lot of time If some of you may remember a guy by the name of Francis Guest. Francis Guest and I used to spend a lot of time sitting at a bar drinking Jack Daniels and asking ourselves who and where are the wealthiest black folks in Middle Tennessee, and how can we get them to really lend not only their finances but kind of their weight to the project. And unfortunately what we discovered is that sort of black wealth in Middle Tennessee is very disparate. There are some folks here and there in other places, but they're very few. And many of them have other things that they're doing too. Not all of them were necessarily fans of this project. So getting that group of people, or those 1 or 2 or 3 people, to kind of weigh in a heavy way on this project was not necessarily going to be easy. So instead we created something called the Barron Society. And we went to a bunch of African Americans and we asked them to commit $25,000 to the museum over a period of 5 years. And it took us about 6 or 8 months, but eventually we raised $1 million through the Barron Society. And then eventually we probably got closer to $2 million of commitments to the Barron Society of folks giving $25,000 or more over a 5-year period of time. So then I was able to go back to those philanthropists and say, the black community is in for $1.5 million. And no, it's not one person, it's 25 people. And those 25 people represent at least this much money. And so then it became, okay, there really is some buy-in for this project, and it made it easier for them to get behind it financially. So again, long answer, short question, but wasn't sure which way you were coming at it. So hopefully one of those was helpful.
I don't have a question, more of a, just want to say thank you. I was introduced to you by Marcus Whitney. I watched this podcast, and I was just like, really just I guess in that moment, I was pretty upset with myself and upset with where we are in business, but listening to your story and the fact that it took like 8-10 years to really get this project going, it was just like really motivating. So just want to say thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, and the museum was 23 years in the making. And yeah, I was kind of the last 8. But it was 23 years in the making, and some things are kind of worth fighting for, and I think for our community this was one of them. That I think that over today, but certainly over a period of years, I think this museum will make Nashville just a better place. It'll make it a more inclusive and more welcoming and more a community that kind of understands that everybody has a place. There's no need to exclude anyone, but everybody has a place at the table. Everybody can achieve. Everybody has contributed greatness to what we call America and to what we call Nashville. And I think that this will be a representative of that, not just for our city and its residents, but for anybody who looks at Nashville as a place they would want to live, work, play, move their business, build their business. I think this museum helps tell that story. So thank you.
Mr. Hicks, we do have a couple questions via the virtual audience.
Cool.
So I'll start from the top. We have one. What was the most difficult aspect of moving from the role of deal maker to curator?
I didn't. This is all about the deal. The museum has been all about the deal, from the location of the museum, which required some deal making, to negotiating with the developer who built 5th and Broadway, and our role as something of a tenant in that space was all about the deal, to negotiating with donors, all about the deal. So this has been to negotiating with politicians, both at the state and the local level, all about the deal. So my background and sort of in the roles that I played before, it has been remarkable to me as I've gone through this process, just how much my previous background and experiences allowed me along the way to say, I've seen this movie before. And to say, this is the way we need to pivot in this moment because I've been there before. We had a circumstance on Friday, March the 13th, 2020. I went to the board of the museum and got approved a bridge loan to bridge our pledges to the completion of construction. And so construction essentially was moving faster than the payments on the pledges. So we needed to get a loan to bridge the two. So on March 13th, 2020, the board approved that loan. At about 11 o'clock that day, I walked out of the board meeting, got into my car, and was driving down the street, and I got a call from the banker that said, have you heard anything about this thing called COVID-19? I said, yep. He said, well, we're not going to be able to do the deal that we offered you and that you just got approved. We're going to have to change it. So we need more collateral, we need higher interest rate, we're going to have you pay it back faster. All those things are going to have to happen. And we were in a position, quite frankly, where we were behind already on paying our contractors. And so we needed to get that loan approved. And so over about a period of 2 weeks, we had to scramble and get more collateral, get the board to reapprove the change in the terms, get the contractor to be patient for a couple weeks longer, all that stuff to get the loan approved and funded. And so we did. That was harder than any private equity or M&A deal that I'd ever done before. But the fact that I had done those things before enabled me to not lose too much sleep going through that process. I understood what the bankers needed. I understood what I needed to say to donors, investors, partners, board members to get them comfortable, and we worked through it.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
We have another one here. How do you see this museum in conversation with other museums / sites of Black cultural ephemera like the Smithsonian and the Museum of Rock and Soul in Memphis? Is there is there a collaboration between these institutions, or is it sort of every museum for itself?
Yeah, great question. No, so we have started with lots of collaboration. All those folks are my friends, whether I've met them or not. We are not in competition with one another. We should be collaborating. Our objective is to spread, share, and grow interest in the culture, is not to compete. But one of the things that we have done in that vein is in June of this year, we actually pulled together a conference. And I can't remember what we called it, but it was a summit of music museum summit or something of that nature. And we invited the CEOs or leaders of 10 or 15 music museums, Black music museums in particular, from around the country to come to Nashville and see NAMAM, have a couple of meals together, have a little bit of a program and talk about what education and curatorial work in museums is like, and come up with some ideas, some things that we can do together. I don't even know what the outcome of that conference was, but I know we need to do it again, because the main takeaway from that was that 9 out of 10 of the people in those rooms, in that room that we had when we had that event, had never met one another. So they didn't know one another's phone numbers or email addresses, not to mention the ability to collaborate on an exhibit or to share an artifact or an event schedule or whatever else that they might do together. They didn't even know who their colleagues were. So we've started just with that, and we'll continue to do that. But as fundamental as that is important. So it is definitely not, from my perspective, every museum for itself. I mean, we should be figuring out how to do things better and more cost effectively, so that we can do more.
Was Hitsville, USA, and the Motown Museum in that group?
They were. Robin Terry, who runs that museum, was invited, but she was not able to attend. But she and I are in conversation on a regular basis about how we can do things. And we've talked about, for example, and collective impact is kind of a term that's often used in the not-for-profit sector about how people can do things more efficiently. And so she and I have talked about ways that there are programs and things that we can do that she's doing in Detroit, and we can do the same thing here. We can go jointly to go get a grant, which enables the grant size to be larger and the impact to be greater. Everybody wins. And so she was not at that event, but she and I are in regular contact.
They've got a big budget to expand. They could use your technology.
Yeah.
It tracks the history.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I certainly found in this process, for better or for worse, is that every museum project is different. It really is very different. So there are things that we can do together and sort of sharing ideas and things of that nature. But, you know, sort of the revenue mix is always different. The approach to the audience is different. The programming is different, you know. And the experience with construction is different. So what I found in this process was there was no way. We went and certainly toured a bunch of museums around the country trying to glean best practices, and there were none, frankly, as far as I was able to determine. Now, there's certainly things that are best-in-class standards of how to maintain the facility so that the artifacts are protected. There are best-in-class practices of how to raise money and do it in an ethical manner. So those kinds of things are, you know, you need to do really well. But other than that, there actually tends to be a lot of difference in terms of how each institution goes about living out its mission. We've got to kind of find our own way and try to take the best of what others are doing. So there are some similarities that overlap, but it's really interesting how distinct each institution is.
You mentioned how there were some bumps along the way, and then you also referenced the fact that you leaned on your experience, but you also just said that there weren't any best practices. So how do you develop yourself as an executive navigating through this newer, uncharted water venture?
Well, yeah, I mean, I never set out to be a museum executive. And so I think what I meant by that was my experience as a salesperson and as a banker and as a management consultant, as a private equity investor, and all the highs and lows of that part of my professional experience all came into play here. And that example around the loan is one example where, guess what? I had been in a difficult spot with a loan before. So when that came up this time, you know, I didn't freak out as much as I would have otherwise, because like, wait a minute, I've seen this before, and you know, here's how you work your way through that, and you know, if you keep your head about you, you'll come out the other side. So, I mean, I really think that in terms of, you know, you have to keep listening and learning and growing no matter what it is you're doing. You know, I think that, you know, I'm a big professional fan of my wife's. My wife is an elementary school teacher. She teaches first grade, and she knew that was what she wanted to do since she was about 8 years old. And I think she's the best in the country at doing it. She knows exactly how to do what she's doing. She knows how to improvise and change and switch up. She knows how to reach the kids that are excelling at their work, and she knows how to reach the ones that can't quite get it on the first, the second, or the third time. She works really hard at it, and she is dedicated to doing it excellently day in and day out and week in and week out. And I really, in so many ways, try to model myself after that. And I have not had the good fortune of sort of knowing I wanted to be a museum executive since I was 8 years old. So many of the things that I've done along the way, intentionally or unintentionally, prepared me to be here. And so now that I'm here, I have to listen and figure out how to reach the donor that wants to write a check tomorrow and the one that says, I'll never do that. I have to figure out how to, you know, sort of collaborate with my colleagues to get, you know, sort of the best out of them and give the best of myself to them in terms of what we can do together. I have to listen when people are telling me that I'm screwing up, or listen when people tell me that I'm not going about it the right way, and be humble enough to kind of step back and listen and be thoughtful and figure out my own way forward, keeping their counsel in mind. And so these are things that, you know, I think just as a professional, almost sort of no matter what you're doing, you have to be willing to kind of go along for the ride.
And one last question. You mentioned about how important it was for the Black community to financially contribute and get buy-in from that standpoint.
Yeah.
What was the significance of that from whoever was kind of really pressing you to that? Like, if you could kind of go deeper as far why financially was it important for them to contribute and be all in?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, you know, race is just a reality in American society. And while We try very hard to make sure our museum is a place where everybody feels welcome. The fact of the matter is African American is in the name. And so, I think that to the extent that the other part of the reality is if you set the government funding aside, which was kind of equally supported by every taxpayer in here and that kind of thing, most of the money came from white folks who controlled that money. And so the white folks who control that money want to make sure that they are doing the right thing in and around something that, from their perspective, really speaks to a black audience. And so they want to say, look, I'm not going to invest in this if, the black folks who supposedly it's going to benefit more than anybody else are not invested in this. So the same is true regardless, to a certain extent, regardless of your business. Right? I mean, so whatever the business is that you're starting or building or growing, investors are going to look at it and say, how much have you put into it? You're the one that's going to own the majority of the equity. You're the one that's going to benefit the most from the upside. My dollars should help you along the way, but how much have you put into it? And so that really was essentially the philanthropic question that I was being asked was, how much have you, in this instance, meaning the black community, put into it? And so I had to answer that question. Right, wrong, or indifferent, I had to answer that question or else I wasn't going to get their support. So I just set about doing that.
I'm just going to call that out. That's horrible. I mean, if you live in a country that doesn't allow folks to create generational wealth, then I'm embarrassed by that. So I'd like to lean in on the digital membership piece.
Sure.
And ask about your intentional outreach to marginalized communities who have never seen themselves in such a beautiful institution and cannot make the trip to Nashville. And especially if broadband is an obstacle, how do you intend to reach them?
Wow. That is something maybe we haven't wrestled with enough yet, to be honest with you. We have figured out, we have started in this sense. We have a program called Soundtrack for All, and there'll be some announcements forthcoming on that we have been able to get some corporate support to essentially make admission to the museum available at no charge to certain audiences in and around Middle Tennessee. And so that's really where we wanted to start, was figuring out how to make sure, for example, Metro school kids who are 80+% black and brown and 90% on free and reduced lunch, those folks and their families are likely to have a difficult time even finding their way from their communities to downtown Nashville. So, and certainly a $24.95 ticket for an adult to come to the museum is likely to be an impediment. So we are close to announcing something that will help to overcome that. Digitally, we've got a number of programs that we offer in person as well as digitally, and that will allow people that do have broadband access to the museum and some of its programs. We've developed an education curriculum which will be available in online platforms very soon, like Schoology. It may actually already be up on Schoology, and we think it's really pretty innovative and allows teachers to get access to the museum via curriculum. So if the school or the teacher has broadband, he or she can introduce it to the child. We've also made parts of our educational programming available through a partnership with Quaver Music here in Nashville to allow music teachers around the country to get access to some of our programming. So we've figured out ways to do that piece of it. Whether or not that fully resolves your question, probably not, but we'll keep at it.
Mr. Hicks, we have a couple more questions virtually.
Sure.
So the first one, as you try to drive membership, how do you cut through all the noise to make the museum stand out?
Really, really good question. I mean, we are, we're really faced with at the moment. I mean, we're really the thought that really comes to mind is marketing budget. Spend money to cut through the noise and do social media and other types of advertising in innovative and very efficient ways. But we probably, if I had my druthers, we'd spend at least five times what we're spending on marketing and advertising today. Hopefully we'll be able to do that, but we're in an uncertain environment with respect to COVID. So we're not spending what we need to be spending to do that. But I guess, the other piece of it though is we are a unique place, and we try to drive that message home at every chance that we get. So a story never before told until now. The fact that we deal with everything from slave songs to hip hop and everything in between, you're not going to find that experience anyplace else. So we try to highlight what is unique for us and articulate it in such a way that it solves a problem for the visitor, for the potential visitor, so they see that the museum represents an opportunity for them to get something that they otherwise can't get, and to solve a problem that they might think that they have, kind of in terms of getting that information. So hopefully it draws them to us by seeing us as a solution to something they would otherwise not be able to solve.
Thank you. And she also asked, how many unique visitors do you need per year to make your financial model work as you would like?
Yeah, I think we break even at about 200,000 visitors a year. I think in a non-COVID year, and we're really tracking pretty close to that today. I think in a non-COVID year, and that would still assume, by the way, a certain amount of contributed revenue, probably more like 30%, 30 to 40% instead of 50. And then we think in a non-COVID year, we should get to 400,000 to 500,000 visitors a year, and that we'll be operating at cash flow positive at that time.
And I know we're at just about time here, so I'll read one more from the virtual audience. What advice do you have for entrepreneurs who might be discouraged by the amount of red tape it can take to get government funding, support, etc.?
I guess I would just say, look, just like any other hurdle as it relates to building your business, be sure you're going for the right resource for the right reason to achieve your objective. And if you are, then be relentless. We have, in our case, we have found it, we have not gotten everything we've asked for, we've not gotten everything that we've pursued, but what we found is that when people understood the mission of what we were trying to do and the relative value that we were bringing for the dollars that we were seeking, that it wasn't as difficult as it otherwise might be. So I think that, the other thing I would add is get professional help. Sort of pursuing government support is not something for the faint of heart or to necessarily learn on the fly. There are people who do this for a living, and they can help you do it, and they can tell you whether or not you can be successful and where you can be successful. So take advantage of those resources. Don't try to do it yourself. I've spent countless wasted hours walking around up at the state capitol and getting nothing done, and then go into the right meeting with the right person, and it happens. So.
And maybe one more actually from the virtual audience, because we just had one more come in. Do you all have a live music space? And if so, would the museum own the rights to those performances for commercial usage?
Yes, so we do have performance space in the museum. We've in a way, we've got two or three. We do have a theater that seats 200. We have done some performances in those spaces. I think that whether or not we own the rights to those performances is going to really vary on a case-by-case basis. In some cases we do, in some cases we don't. It depends on the contract with the artist, and that sort of thing. And really, many of the live events that we've done so far have been where someone rented our space for their purposes as opposed to directly for our own. And so in those instances, of course, we don't. It belongs to the person who contracted with the artist. We just happen to be the venue. So it varies case by case.
Hello? Okay, great. I just wanted to say thank you as well. I know when I first met you, it was like 4 years ago, and you helped solidify my business. I used to do photography and videography for Name Ma'am. And you and Dion just believing in this young girl. I had just gotten my EIN number, and I'm like, I have this big contract, and y'all kept me so busy. And Autumn Sky Productions is still here because of someone believing in us, because we were not qualified for what we were doing, but I made it work. And you just really, really helped us a lot, believe in who we were and to keep going. So just to let you know that thank you. I always mention Name Ma'am as far as like why we started or how we, because we had to get paid, we had to get an EIN number, we had to get legit. But I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you so much.
Well,
It
I'm so
meant a
glad
lot
that
to
worked
us.
out. That's great
Yes,
news.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
awesome. Hopefully, we're still doing some business with you. All right, good. Yes, sir.
What does self-care look like for you? Because you face a lot of vicissitudes and issues on a daily, monthly, yearly basis. So as an entrepreneur, what is your self-care look like?
Wow, yeah, that's a good question. It is not what it should be. I'll start there. During COVID, I found my golf clubs again and would start kind of about 4 o'clock in the afternoons, going to find some place to go hit a golf ball, not very well and far too often, but that was helpful for me. My assistant now tries to schedule me to take a day off every other week and to take a half a day off on the opposite week. And she gets angry with me sometimes because I'll take that day off that she marked and I'll fill it with meetings, and she'll say, you need to go take some time off. It's been a hard thing, and particularly because the museum is really a 7-day-a-week business. I do try to not be in the museum on the weekends most of the time, and if so, just to kind of go in for the reason I need to go in and then leave so I can go do some other things. One of the things that is a self-care tool is my museum email does not come to my phone. So I try to avoid, walking down Fifth Avenue with looking down at my phone, and instead try to look up and enjoy kind of whatever's going on around me. Once or twice a year, I'll take at least a week off, and I will turn everything off and truly not connect to the museum for at least a week. So those are the kinds of things that come in. As I've gotten older, I've started on occasion getting a manicure and a pedicure as something to at least kind of take 45 minutes and kind of get away from everything and just kind of let somebody else take care of that maintenance for me for a few minutes. So that's there. I like to drive fast cars. So I'm between fast cars at the moment, but that's something that helps. So anyway, I mean, those are some things that come in. Thank you for asking. Yeah.
In the digital area, I'm studying this new trend with cryptocurrencies, NFTs, non-fungible tokens. Have NFTs come into fundraising on
They have not, at least not for us. I mean, we haven't seen any crypto or NFTs. We've had some very preliminary conversations with people who want to do some NFT-related kinds of programs and initiatives and things of that nature. It's all kind of going like this for me, and so they haven't gotten very far. I mean, I'm happy to learn at the right time, but not yet. I mean, about the kind of the most complicated thing we've run into so far is we've had some folks donate stock that we need to hold for a period of time. Oftentimes with an institution like ours, the policy around accepting stock would be you take it and liquidate it immediately because you don't want to take the volatility risk associated with the security. But we've had a couple of instances where we've needed to hold the security for a period of time. And we're looking at some tax credit related transactions, which can be pretty complex financial vehicles. And so we've gotten into that, but no NFTs or Bitcoins really. Yeah.
All right, Mr. Hicks, I know we're at just about time and you're headed to the podcast studio, but just wanted to say thank you so much from our virtual audience and from the EC for sharing your story. We really enjoyed it and are very grateful. So
Well, thank you. Thank you all very much. Come see the museum.